I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Just wanted to let you guys know that there were some audio issues I did not realize was going on until about halfway through the episode. I severely apologize for that, and I will be double checking to make sure the audio is all good from now on. I hope you enjoy the episode. If you are interested in supporting this podcast and at the same time getting all my episodes ad-free, then please head to my website, 3dprintingbasicspod.com. Again, that's 3dprintingbasicspod.com. There you can find all the links to support me, my affiliate links, and as a perk, you can get all my episodes ad-free if you subscribe on Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Music. Again, all my links will be there, as well as a contact form if you have any questions. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 55, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about something that I probably should have talked about a long time ago, and that is printing overhangs and using supports. 3D printing is definitely one of the most amazing technologies that I have come across, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have flaws. One of the biggest flaws in 3D printing is its inability to print overhangs of about more than 45-ish degrees. If you try to print overhangs of more than 45 degrees without any supports, then you could run into some problems like drooping and curling. But we're going to talk about that as well as some tips on how to avoid these nasty issues when you're printing with overhangs. So with that being said, let's get right into the episode. Alright, so first things first, I want to talk about what is an overhang. And an overhang, as I'm sure most of you know, is when you are trying to print something over open air in 3D printing. So say you are trying to print a shelf or you have an angle going upwards. As soon as your printer is not printing on previously printed layers and rather is printing over open space, that is an overhang. And overhangs, surprisingly, are actually somewhat easy. If you have one that's less than 45 degrees, then it usually prints flawlessly, because when you have an overhang of less than 45 degrees, then enough of the newly extruded layer is laying down on the non-extruded layer. And so this is how you got to think about it. It's a little bit tough for me to explain, but let me give it a shot. When you're printing layer by layer and you have an overhang, think of it as maybe half of the newly printed layer is being laid down on the old layer and half is being laid over open space. Now you won't need supports since half of it is going down on the old layer, leaving the other half in open space, but that is enough to where it's not going to droop and it's not going to curl, so that is usable. If you have an overhang of say 70 degrees, in this case, maybe that means that 30% of the newly printed layer is being set down on the old layer, with 70% of it being laid over open space. That might not work, especially because the melted plastic is very susceptible to being pulled down by gravity. Gravity will pull that down because it doesn't have sufficient support, and you will get drooping and or curling. This episode is brought to you by PCBWay. Ready to take your electronics projects to the next level? PCBWay offers everything you need, from custom PCBs to 3D printing and even CNC machining, all under one roof. They're trusted by engineers and makers worldwide for their exceptional quality and fast turnaround. And here's a special deal for listeners of 3D Printing Basics. Use the promo code 3DPrinting2, SQUARED, to get $10 off your first order. Start your next project with PCBWay and see the difference for yourself. Head over to PCBWay.com today. Now, as technology gets better and better, especially at this rapid pace that we're on with 3D printers, this number, this kind of magic number for whether you do or don't need supports, is getting greater and greater all the time. I would say definitely back when I was getting started, there was kind of a hard line at 45 degrees. You just needed supports if you were going to have an overhang of more than 45 degrees or it wasn't going to work. Now, I'm myself am printing overhangs of 60 degrees, 55 degrees, pushing that kind of boundary, and it's still working out just fine. So as technology advances, this number will get greater and greater, but it's still really important to know your own printer and dial it in so that you know which overhangs you can print and which ones you require support. And another factor of the advancing technology is that supports aren't nearly as much of a pain as they were back in the day. Thankfully, supports nowadays, they have their own settings you can tweak, and you can have them be very easily removable. They won't mar up your print surface, and just overall, they're much more functional than they were back in the day. So thankfully, with all this advancing technology, overhangs aren't nearly as much as a problem as they were, say, 5 years ago. Okay, so I'm going to give you some tips that I found help me whenever I'm printing overhangs, especially if I'm struggling. If I'm struggling printing overhangs, almost the first thing that I always go to is to dry your filament. If you have wet filament, it's more susceptible. It's not as structurally sound, so you're a little bit more susceptible to drooping or curling. And again, just if you're drooping, then it just means that your print, the newly laid filament, is sagging as gravity is pulling it down because it doesn't have good cooling and it doesn't have enough support from the previous layer. And curling is when you also have insufficient cooling, but it actually causes the layers to curl up, and that can really ruin your print. So like I said, if you're having any of those problems, my first step is usually to dry your filament, because dry filament is more structurally sound and it will work better for overhangs. Tip number 2 is to lower the nozzle temperature. A lot of these problems with overhangs are caused by insufficient cooling. The filament itself cannot cool down fast enough, and that is causing the drooping or curling. So you can help yourself out there by lowering the nozzle temperature, not so much that you're not efficiently melting it and then you're having problems with your print overall. So I would say that you can definitely help yourself out there by just lowering the temperature just a slight bit and kind of giving your filament a head start on the cooling process, which gives it a little bit of a better chance of printing overhang successfully. Another tip is to decrease the print speed, especially if you're doing really small bridges. Decreasing the print speed can really help out, because if you're going really fast, that might not give it enough time to cool properly and would definitely that would definitely decrease the ability for overhangs to be printed effectively. So if you're doing some smaller overhangs, definitely decrease the print speed. I know that even with all the advancements, there's settings for it now. So make sure that you look into that so that you can make sure that you're printing overhangs effectively. Another tip is to boost cooling. A lot of printers have really good cooling nowadays, but you can also look into and kind of boost your cooling. You can increase fan speeds. You can even add another fan. There are lots of abilities to kind of tweak your cooling settings. So I would say definitely experiment with that. There's lots of tests out there. There's a lot of overhang tests that you can find just on Thingiverse. Anywhere you can find them, and you can tweak the settings. You can mess around with them and find out what works best for you, especially when it comes to printing overhangs. So make sure you look into that, and boosting cooling is definitely a great way to help yourself out with that. And now that we've talked about how to print overhangs successfully, I want to talk about supports. Supports is definitely an important part of 3D printing. We use them almost exclusively for overhangs that are more than that 45 to 55 degree mark. And they are a huge part of the 3D printing industry, especially nowadays with the advancement in technology. Supports are easier to use. They don't mess up the surface like they may be used to. And you can tweak settings so that you can really change whatever you want, especially with the tree supports that are happening now. And that's a perfect segue, actually, because I want to talk about the two main types of support that there is. There is quote-unquote normal support, which is the support that's been around forever. It kind of looks like towers or buildings or like a city skyline building its way up as it supports the overhangs. And then the new kid on the block, even though it's not so new anymore, are tree supports. And
it basically looks like a tree. It's got a big trunk at the bottom that then splits off into a bunch of little branches that ends up supporting each piece as it goes. And in my opinion, I use tree supports over normal supports about 90% of the time. They are much easier to use, they use less filament, and they are easier to remove. And in my experience, they leave a better quality finish on the area that they're supporting. So I'm almost always using tree supports, but either way, normal supports and tree supports, they definitely have their spot in 3D printing. Normal supports are usually used on printed items that are really low in height, like less than 10 millimeters. I'm almost always using normal supports because when you have a really small print, tree supports, it doesn't have that time to sort of branch out and in that really effective way that tree supports are known for. So you kind of just stick with a ton of little trunks that are pretty difficult to remove and can kind of weld themselves to the part. So that's definitely something to look out for. If you have really small prints that are under a certain size, definitely consider using normal supports because that's where normal supports will come in and they will be really effective. Also in my research, if you have prints that have large flat areas that you want to support, so example, if you have, say you're printing a giant letter H and the middle crossbar of the H, that's a large flat area that needs to be supported. It might not work so well with tree supports because the complexity of the structure, it might significantly increase print time. So look into normal supports and just make sure overall whenever you're printing something, try both normal and tree supports and compare and contrast, especially with the slicing software. It's so easy. You change one button and you can see both. You can see the print time, the material cost, how much material it uses. So make sure you're just always comparing either or and seeing which one works better and is more efficient for you. But I will say that probably 80 to 90% of the time, tree supports is going to be the answer for you. And you also got to think about post-processing. Like I said, tree supports usually are much easier to remove because there's only a small amount that is actually connected to the part. Whereas if you have normal supports, then it's kind of one giant block that is all connected to the part, and that can damage and also be more difficult to remove from your part. The last thing I wanted to touch on is my personal experience. In my personal experience, I tend to not mess around with trying to print overhangs too much, especially when they're kind of broaching that super close, like 55-degree margin that's kind of towing the line of what might be successful and what might not be successful. I feel like supports in this rapid advancement have become super useful and not nearly as cumbersome as they were in the past. So I almost always opt to use supports, even in places where I think it might not be needed. The only time where I really opt to not use supports is when they have small flat areas that are really small, like under 5 millimeters in length, because in my opinion, that's just it's not really worth it. It's going to print the same whether you use supports or not supports. The area is so small that the bridging will work great and it won't have enough time to droop or sag or anything like that. So that's kind of my philosophy when it comes to 3D printing overhangs. I almost always use tree supports. I use normal supports, like I said, on large flat areas. And when it comes to the smaller flat areas, I don't really use supports at all. But that is something for you to experiment with and try out and figure out for yourself. Please don't take everything I say as the word of law. I'm just a guy with a lot of 3D printers and some experience in the 3D printing industry. Please do your own research and experiment with yourself and decide for yourself what might work best for you. With that being said, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to you next time.